The salt air in Newport usually smelled of dried cod and ambition, but by December 1776, it smelled only of cold iron and wet wool. Elias Thorne stood on the edge of Queen Anne's beautiful square, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a coat that was far too thin for a Rhode Island winter. Before him, the harbor, once a forest of merchant masts, was now a jagged line of British men of war. The HMS Renown sat like a black-timbered god on the water, its cannons aimed squarely at the heart of the colony's golden bird. The British hadn't just arrived. They had exhaled onto the city and frozen it in place. General Henry Clinton's boots clicked rhythmically against the cobblestones as he led 6,000 redcoats and Hessian mercenaries into the streets. "They're taking the South Church," a voice whispered beside Elias. It was Sarah, a daughter of a local printer, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. "They're ripping out the pews, Elias. They say they need the wood for fires and the space for their horses." Elias felt a surge of heat that had nothing to do with the freezing wind. Newport was a crown jewel of the colonies, a place of religious tolerance and soaring steeples, and now it was being stripped for kindling. The drama of Newport wasn't found on a sprawling battlefield, but in the hushed, candlelit parlors of Thames Street. For 3 years, the city became a ghost of itself. Friends who had toasted the king's health for decades now looked away when they passed in the street. Elias worked as a clerk for a loyalist merchant, a position that allowed him to move through the docks with a ledger in hand and a secret in his boot. He was part of a watch, a thin line of spies sending word to General Washington's men on the mainland. Wood was so scarce that the British tore down over 400 buildings for fuel. Continental forces were gathering in Tiverton, preparing to cross. The French fleet, under Comte d'Estaing, was spotted on the horizon. In August 1778, the tension finally snapped. The French ships appeared like white ghosts through the fog, their heavy guns ready to liberate the city. Elias stood on the cliffs of Brenton Point, his heart hammering. This is it, he thought, the end of the redcoats. But the sky turned a bruised, sickly purple. A great storm, a hurricane of such ferocity it felt like the wrath of God, descended upon the coast. For 2 days, the world was nothing but screaming wind and crashing surf. When the fog cleared, the French fleet was shattered, forced to limp away to Boston for repairs. The American land forces, left exposed on the north end of the island, were forced into a bloody retreat at the Battle of Rhode Island. Elias watched from a cellar window as the wounded were carted back into town. The liberation had failed. The silence that followed was heavier than the occupation itself. The British finally sailed away in 1779, leaving behind a city that was a skeletal version of its former glory. They burned the lighthouses and took the town records with them, sinking the history of Newport into the Atlantic. But as Elias stood on the wharf in 1780, watching a new fleet arrive, the French under Rochambeau, this time to stay, he realized that Newport's spirit wasn't in its pews or its records. It was in the stubbornness of the people who remained. He pulled a crumpled broadside from his pocket. It was a notice of independence, yellowed and frayed. He smoothed it out against a salt-stained pillar. The war wasn't over, but as the French lilies fluttered alongside the colonial stars in the Newport breeze, Elias finally felt the winter thaw. "We have lost our houses," he whispered to the departing tide, "but we have found our country."
The drums beat low in the Boston mist. A shadow falls on the cobblestone, where fingers curled in a blood-stained fist, and seeds of a frantic gale were sown. The tea lies dark in the salt-rimmed bay, a bitter brew for a distant king, as the golden light of the old world's day dies where the rebel lanterns swing. One if by land, and two if by sea. A spark takes flight through the midnight grass, to wake the ghosts of the used-to-be, and watch the thundering redcoats pass. At Lexington, where the green was stained, the silence broke with a sudden crack, and the heavy weight of a crown unchained sent a nation's heart on a one-way track, through the frozen hell of the Valley Forge, where breath is smoke and the boots are skin. The fire is fanned in a winter's gorge, to temper the steel of the men within. No finery here, no lace or gold. Just the rhythmic pulse of a flintlock spark, defying the bite of the biting cold, and the hollow howl of the coming dark. From the southern pines to the northern crags, the cry goes up through the smoke and lead, beneath the flutter of homespun rags, and the soil that drinks from the fallen dead. The Yorktown sun climbs a weary sky, to see the sword of the empire yield, while the echoes of a long-fought cry fade soft across the clover field. The chains are burst, the ink is dry, the stars are stitched in a crimson row, a promise breathed to a restless sky, born of the blood of long ago.
Thank you for following my short stories. And to God be the glory. Make America great again.